Is the portrayal of violence in video games desensitizing the player? From the very beginning, it's clear to see that as games have progressed, and the technology alongside it, the amount of violence present within games has been ever increasing, whether that's the amount of violence, detail of violence, realism, or excessiveness. The trend between increase in a game's overall capabilities and amount of violence included in violent-oriented games is clear. From the very early space war containing only limited ship explosions, straight to Space Invaders which included fighting and killing living beings. Fast forward to today, when we have games like Hellish Quart, a game with realistic injuries, ability to cut off limbs on your opponent as blood spurts all over the field, staining the characters and ground. Also containing accurate wound positioning on the player as a decrease in limitations makes an increase in realism. It's clear to see why some are under the belief that these games aren't safe to be a part of, let alone be experiencing as a player. When it comes to research, I believe that it's important to ask those who are directly affected, and so that's just what I did. I sent out a questionnaire with procedures in place to avoid being nullified to troll responses, and when asked, players said that they do not believe that video games caused violence or violent imagery, and also agreed that this doesn't change even to exceptionally young or vulnerable players who may be more prone to suggestion. This was a very interesting result, as I didn't expect the results to be so one-sided, with some responses including extra messages, such as, "I believe the coverage on how susceptible children are is out of proportion and not true." 66% of responders said that intricacy can add to immersion, as well as immersion leading to influencing the player's mind and thoughts. Alongside this, 40% of people, when given a choice of 3 images, said the one that they voted for as most violent was also their favourite, almost contradicting the earlier responses they had given when delved into in more detail. It's also important to look at how violence, which isn't supposed to be prominent within games for children, has been able to be present down to workarounds, such as different terminology, different coloured blood. So, for example, in the game Plants vs. Zombies Garden Warfare, that has a PEGI age rating of 7, blood is never present, and instead of terminology like kill, it's instead with terminology like vanquish. The game is in third person, and none of the guns use bullets. Instead, they use paintballs, footballs, concrete, and goo. And so, as a result, a PEGI 7 violent shooter game is made with realistic body drops, body permeance applied to corpses, accompanied by screams as characters die. The question is the game desensitized enough to be fine for kids to play? Or rather, are these just workarounds and loopholes that get younger players into violent games? From this, I personally believe a lot of them are suitable to make the game safe for a younger audience. However, I can very easily see the other side of the coin, that these are mere loopholes and not fixes. As children are more impressionable at a younger age, this may be a problem, as they play a game rewarding them for inflicting violence and could potentially be desensitized to the imagery of death and pain. From my secondary research, I found that hardcore or habitual players of video games can have a reduced empathy for pain due to overexposure to violence in games. But it's very important to mention the lack of reference in how the research was carried out, in the report and others like it. Nonetheless, it did have a strong focus on the fact that non-habitual players or gamers didn't experience the reduced empathy. So the question remains, are the games and immersion the issue, or is it down to the player's individual perspective on what they're doing, as they separate it as being just a game? Some games take a different approach to violence, and that's the usage of the over-the-top excessive violence. This does usually mean it's kept behind a higher age rating, however, which does signal that everyone agrees that the imagery in these games isn't suitable for certain people, the same way we wouldn't want young people seeing real violence. But it could also be argued that this violence is so over-the-top and intricate or inaccurate that it could not possibly stop people reacting normally to real violence, and yet games such as Mortal Kombat, surrounded in controversy due to excessive violence, are typically the ones played for tests on a person's response to violence, when looking at how people respond to it differently, potentially meaning that the results aren't the most reliable in testing for desensitization in tests in the past. A lot of the research I conducted all seemed to point out that people in the tests were becoming desensitized over an elongated period of time of exposure to violent games, before being less empathetic to violent imagery and videos. I think this is what it comes down to. It's common online for people to be scared of how games affect the players, but it's only ever down to an excessive amount of exposure to them, not a normal amount of exposure to them. But this can be said about any form of graphic media, from books to film to video games to even music, as an excessive overexposure of anything will affect a person's response to that action or event. Overall, when looking at all the evidence, both primary and secondary, there's no denying that violent video games will somewhat affect or desensitize someone's view of violence. And in short, that is the answer. But when we delve deeper, people don't realize it affects them. And I believe this is due to two main factors. The first being the effects are usually minor, and the effects are usually only for a short term after experiencing that video game, which explains the contradictory messages on my primary research and surveys. The second reason, though, is it's no different to how plenty of other everyday occurrences and media intakes are already affecting them. And to answer the question of do video games desensitize the player and look at it in a long term, yes, they can, but only due to excessive overexposure. And it's no different to other types of media.